Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm really pleased to welcome you all to the first public event in a new series on the effects of the COVID pandemic on Germany and the United States. To public webinars like this one, we will also be producing podcasts, the first of which has already been published on our website, and written analysis. In this project, we are exploring the impact on the health systems of both countries, on the US and German economies, and our focus today is on how the pandemic is providing a new landscape for the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation, and also extremism. So I'm going to turn the floor over in just a moment to my colleague, Liz Hoteri, who will be our moderator and chair today's discussion. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, the Transatlantic Program of the German Ministry of the Economy and Energy. Thank them for their support through the European Recovery Program, which makes this series possible. And so with that, Liz, let me give you the microphone and you can guide us through today's session.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm pleased to welcome our distinguished panel today. We'll first, Meili Criezis, who is a graduate fellow at the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERIL. She's also a PhD student in Justice Law and Criminology at American University and a contributor to the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. Brian Hughes is a research assistant professor at the Justice Law and Criminology program at AU as well, and he's also the associate director of PERIL. And Cynthia Miller-Idriss is professor at the School of Public Affairs and the School of Education at AU and the director of PERIL. And on the German side, we have Constanze Jeitler, who is a historian and a PhD researcher at PACT, which stands for Populism, Conspiracy Theory, and Conspiracy Theory at the University of Tübingen. And just a quick reminder to our attendees before we get started, please use the Q&A function. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, you can submit those questions at any point throughout the seminar, and I will read those to our panelists. And now we can get started, and Brian, I will turn the microphone over to you.
Thanks very much, Liz. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks to my co-panelists, and of course, thanks to everyone in the audience for coming virtually today to listen to this important discussion on this topic. I'm going to kick things off by trying to describe some of the categories that we try to think about when we're looking at this issue of conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories aren't always as cut and dried as they might appear on the face of things. Conspiracy theories are really part of a larger taxonomy of problematic messages or content or media. And Jeff alluded to some of these. We like to put them into three categories: misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Now, misinformation is erroneous or misleading information. It can be a misleading or incorrect or fanciful narrative. Fake news is a word that gets thrown around a lot. It's not very well defined, but it's an appropriate placeholder in some cases. Now, the converse of that is disinformation. That's erroneous or misleading information that is intentionally disseminated to be misleading. The motive of the person creating or spreading it is to deceive. So whereas misinformation may be shared in earnest by a person who genuinely believes it, disinformation is created or spread by someone who believes in it and has an ulterior motive. And then there's a third category that we're being asked to consider more and more in our work, and that's malinformation. And malinformation is accurate information that's shared in a way that's intended to mislead or to injure its audience or people associated with its audience. And malinformation actually can be used to give credibility, particularly to disinformation conspiracy theories. Malinformation can provide the germ of truth that information operations use to spread larger, malicious, untrue narratives. Now, to return to misinformation and disinformation, conspiracy theories are typically in one or the other category. Some are sincere, some are malign. But when we're talking about conspiracy theories themselves are actually part of a larger taxonomy of history and current events. And here's kind of where it gets a little complicated, or even more complicated. We like to split conspiracy theories, or that taxonomy, I should say, into 4 separate categories. There are conspiracy theories that don't really have even a drop of reality to them. Now, some of these are very fanciful, and on the face of them might even seem harmless. There's one floating around that says the country of Finland doesn't actually exist. That's true. That's a real conspiracy theory that some people believe. Finland isn't real. Another one that you'll see is birds aren't real. Now, sometimes this is shared ironically, but some people really sincerely believe that birds are drones. Now, as I said, these could be harmless, except for the context in which they emerge. Because what we see is that some of these conspiracy theories that don't even have a drop of reality, they can act as a bridge to the next kind of conspiracy theory, which are the ones that tend to be truly malign. These are the ones that are pegged to reality. So they incorporate actual people, actual events, but they're still entirely false. And these are the ones that are most closely tied up with disinformation and information ops. So to give you an example, Pizzagate is a very clear example of this. There is a pizza parlor called Comet Ping Pong in suburban Washington, D.C. The Hillary Clinton campaign did host events there. There were some emails that were leaked that, you know, we had some kind of strange inside joke that no one quite understood, but could be manipulated and sort of interpreted in this malign way to point to this fantasy of child trafficking out of the basement of this Comet Ping Pong restaurant. Another example is the Great Reset. You know, our policymakers and global business do convene to strategize the best way to move forward with concern to global markets and to the environment, you know, multi-stakeholder governance, and so on and so on. The term the Great Reset has been used in some of those meetings and conferences. But what happens is, though, that reality is then pegged to this conspiracy theory of a sort of conspiratorial, orchestrated, top-down new world order that's going to enslave most of humanity. These conspiracy theories are seized upon by malicious actors, both individuals, activist groups on the far right in particular, but also sometimes on the far left, and national governments. We do know that the Russian government and the Chinese government are responsible for spreading some of these. And some of these refer to COVID-19 and are intended to increase vaccine hesitancy, COVID denialism, and anti-vaccine sentiment and beliefs as a way of weakening the social bonds and the economies and the political stability of countries that are seen as their adversaries. I'll move rather quickly since I don't want to run out of time here. From here, we actually move into categories that aren't necessarily conspiracy theories. There are historical and current events where there's a great deal of ambiguity or even good reason to suspect that there might be more there than meets the eye. UFOs are a fun example of this. We know that there are UFOs. There are things that people see in the sky, pilots and so forth, and we just don't know what they are. Are they atmospheric phenomenon? Are they experimental drones? Are they some kind of drone missile? Or is there a slim chance that maybe they are Martians? There's so much ambiguity there that we just don't know. It's not a proper conspiracy theory. Another example here in the United States is the JFK assassination. We know that there's more to that story than meets the eye, but we don't know what exactly is missing. We don't know if it's gross incompetence. We don't know if it's some Cold War secrets that aren't available to the public for good reasons of national security, or there is always that very slim chance that, yes, it was the mafia killing JFK to get back at him for having an affair with Marilyn Monroe. Okay, so I'm being a little bit, glib or lighthearted, about this. But the point is that when we deny the ambiguity of cases like this, we actually lose credibility with the public. And that gives fuel to the actual conspiracy theorists. They can say, oh, well, for goodness sake, we know that there are big gaps in the story of the Kennedy assassination. So you just say that anything that might impugn the official narrative is just a conspiracy theory. You're not credible. And at the same time, we help to create a way for politicians, business interests, and so on to dismiss legitimate accusations of corruption and conspiracy. And this is really the fourth and final category, actual proven conspiracy and corruption. Some examples, of course, are the Iran-Contra affair here in the United States, and the fabricated evidence of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction that was used to take the United States and some allies into the war in Iraq. Now, maybe not every thread is tied up neatly in these cases, but there's more than enough evidence to make a sound judgment. So it's really incumbent on us to be as precise as possible when we're talking about conspiracy theories and when we're talking about whether something is misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation. It's really important that we acknowledge actual corruption and conspiracy, and that we recognize the role of ambiguity, and we cultivate the ability to keep a sort of case open attitude rather than a case closed attitude in those ambiguous cases. The key to that, I think, is a process of better education and communication, specifically on the role of ambiguity in these questions, and in the role of ambiguity in our public life as citizens of democratic societies, not just for the public, but also for ourselves as educators and people who are responsible for communicating these ideas to the public. It can be very frustrating for a researcher not to have an ironclad answer to a question. But that will really make a big difference in terms of teaching the public how to recognize and how to reject the actual damaging and false conspiracy theories that truly are a threat to our social fabric. I think my time is up. I'll leave it at that. And I think Cynthia is next to get into some more specifics. So thank you very much.
Terrific. Thanks, Brian. Thank you, Liz and Jeff and AICGS. And just looking over the participant lists, I see we have many friends of AICGS here and of Peril and colleagues from different government agencies and here and also overseas. And so just want to welcome everyone and say what a pleasure it is to be with you. I'm going to keep my remarks very brief as well. I would like to hand it off to Meili, without too much ado and hear more specifically about some of the conspiracy theories that she's going to describe to you. But I want to say sort of two things following on the categories that Brian has laid out that have sort of defined what some of these conspiracies look like. I want to talk about why people are vulnerable to them and why they might be more vulnerable to them during a pandemic like the one we're in. And also what some early evidence suggests, at least about what's most effective to combat them. So when we're looking at why people are more vulnerable or why there is such a strong set of belief in conspiracy theories right now, particularly in something like QAnon, which is really like a big umbrella of conspiracy theories, not a single conspiracy theory, as I'm sure Meili will describe in a minute. We know that people are vulnerable to conspiracies when they face something inexplicable or seemingly inexplicable in their life, right? So we tend to see conspiracy theories around events like the Sandy Hook shooting, in which 26 people died, 20 of whom were first graders in Connecticut. assassinations or deaths, unexpected deaths like Princess Di or JFK, when people die, or JFK Jr. for that matter, when people die unexpectedly or are assassinated, when you have something like a global pandemic, where people feel they're faced with something unknowable, where there's uncertainty, and when they feel out of control, when they feel they don't have control over a situation, even if that's not fully acknowledged to themselves, when they're faced with something that frightens them, that feels like there must be a reason why that could happen. And maybe that means it wouldn't happen to me, right? Or there must be a reason why that happened to that person or that family, or didn't happen. And it couldn't be true because it's not acceptable to imagine that 26 people could die in an elementary school. So it's easier to actually believe that it's made up. So it fits into a kind of, it gives people a black and white reality when they're faced with something very gray. It gives them a sense of agency often and purpose, because some of these conspiracy theories have a call to action in them, like QAnon, which actually calls on people for the kind of core of it to fight child trafficking, right? So an action-oriented thing where you can fight something truly evil. It's one of the reasons why women have been more attracted to it than a lot of other previous conspiracy theories. So because they're called upon as mothers, particularly at a moment when I would say many people have feared for their families, right? So it's not an excuse necessarily, but it's an explanation for why you have seen such vulnerability during the pandemic, I think, to some of these conspiracy theories. But we're also in an era where, so the first thing is there's just more uncertainty, more vulnerability. People tend to have conspiracy theories circulate and be more receptive to them in those kinds of moments. When there's anxiety, uncertainty, unpredictability, or lack of control. But we also have legitimate sources of information. This echoes some of what Brian was saying, often reinforcing or failing to condemn some of those conspiracy theories. So either elected officials here in the US who are openly espousing QAnon-style conspiracy theories, or others like Soros funded the migrant caravan, right, is a conspiracy theory that has been openly supported or failed to condemn or by elected officials at the state and national level in the US, or on mainstream media, pundits. You know, when people turn on a television to a channel that they believe is a source of information, of legitimate information, or they hear a political speech that's echoing a conspiracy theory like the Great Replacement by using the same language, replacement of immigrants. And I know Meili will get into that specific conspiracy theory in a minute. Those things are damaging, right? It's particularly damaging because, again, it lends this sense of legitimacy to something that might seem preposterous. So the sources of of valid information seem to be blending or reinforcing the conspiracy in ways that make it seem more true. Okay, so that says a little bit about vulnerability and reinforcement. Now, how do you combat it? So there are a couple of things we've learned. One, it's incredibly difficult to combat conspiracy theories. I think it's the most difficult part of the extremist spectrum to counter because traditionally, historically, attempts to counter conspiracy theories tend to be met with through the lens of the conspiracy, right? So it can actually cause people to just dig in their heels further and become even deeper committed. You become, as an explainer or as an intervener, part of the conspiracy that you're trying to combat. This is also true for journalists. Sometimes just talking about them, just mentioning conspiracy theories can further embed them in a kind of in the minds of willing or receptive listeners. And so that can make things more difficult to combat. So two things we have found. One is that obviously this goes for all kinds of extremism. It's far easier to prevent something from happening than it is to try to disengage someone from it once it's already taken hold. So disengagement, de-radicalization is extremely difficult in general across the extremist spectrum, very difficult to initiate, as far as I know, impossible to do at scale. And so can only really be done on small, individual, long-term engagement, almost like therapy rather than counter messaging. And that's true for conspiracy theories as well. It has to really be done at an individual or small scale level for the most part. Preventative work, though, we found two different kinds of things. One is inoculation, which is something that our lab works on, which is the attempt to show people before they encounter it what the tactics are, what the persuasive tactics and strategies, rhetorical techniques, narrative styles are of extremist actors or of conspiracy frameworks. So for example, we'll point out to people that, if you see language around orchestration, a cabal of elites, somebody who's trying to manipulate to wield power, right? There's certain kinds of things that just show up in the playbook of almost every conspiracy. Then you can start to, have a little bit of doubt that that might be true, right? So recognize the scaffold of a conspiracy theory. So there's some good evidence that that's sticky, meaning people can be taught to recognize in one conspiracy theory how there's a scaffold that applies to others, and then they're more skeptical when they encounter it. That feeds into the second thing, which is a broader need for media and literacy training in general. So this scaffold, this conspiracy that Brian mentioned about all birds being drones, for example, is one I use in my own classes because that's when it's totally unpolitical. You don't get into anything partisan. You can just get students to investigate. How do you know actually that all birds are not drones? What if you had to investigate that? You can do a whole classroom exercise around that. It is relatively entertaining, and a lot of students aren't aware that there is a real conspiracy theory that circulates that birds are drones. And once they start digging into it, then you can start to talk about source integrity. How do you verify sources? How do you understand something as disinformation? And so those are some exercises that we do. We have some tools on our website that I can drop in the chat later that are free and available to the public, including some discussion guides for teachers, including that exercise about birds being drones, for example, that we use. So the need for greater media literacy at very early levels and throughout life to help people be more skeptical consumers of the information that they encounter, particularly as we move into an era of deep fakes, I think is going to be really, really important as well. So I will hand it off to Meili to talk a little bit about the conspiracy theories that she's seeing, and then we'd like to hear about the German case, I know. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and also thank you to AICGS. So I will get a little bit into more detail about some of these specific conspiracy theories. I'll keep my comments short as well, make sure to have a lot of time for the German case and then also for questions and answer session. But the first one I want to quickly review is QAnon. So it emerged from 4chan in 2017 when an anonymous user claimed to have a security clearance called Q clearance. This individual began posting cryptic messages, which later became known as Q drops. And basically what the premise is, the large general premise is imagining a cabal of elites conspiring for a new world order, which also, of course, includes a lot of anti-Semitic conspiracies and tropes that have been recycled from past conspiracies, because these things, they build on the history of previous conspiracies that have existed before them. And then also the conspiracy about there existing a pedophile ring of elites, and then that which has been a very main stay point for QAnon. But interestingly, the communities related to QAnon in online spaces are quite decentralized, where individuals are encouraged to connect the dots, or Q drops, where individuals are told to go out and do their own research. And so for people that are feeling this perhaps this rush from doing research on their own, they might feel a sense of empowerment and agency and being part of a larger like almost resistance against these globalist elites. Of course, that is quite anti-Semitic in root in terms of the verbology of globalist elites. So the next conspiracy that we've examined too is Plandemic. So that is a 26-minute documentary that was released in May 2020 about sinister plans behind the current pandemic, the current COVID pandemic. So the documentary, to gain credibility, uses a heavy reliance on so-called expert testimonies, and then proposes that some sort of shadowy elite group, it has something to hide and is suppressing voices of truth regarding the COVID pandemic. So by using a truth teller approach, they are of course, these expert witnesses, they are trying to provide a certain validation and documentary style and mimic that and also mimic a valid approach, and try to have individuals see this documentary and think, wow, look at all these expert names that are involved in this documentary. They are revealing something that has never been revealed to the world before, and now we are in on it, and now we must combat it. So it's, again, speaking a lot to that sense of, here is, we're providing you with a road for agency, do your own research, and they are trying to hide something for you, do not let them get away with it. So a lot of reliance, I think, on emotional appeal to potential audiences, and then also, of course, factual manipulation and the manufacturing of so-called experts is quite important in that dynamic. And then the final prominent narrative that is out there, unfortunately gaining a lot more traction, is the Great Replacement theory, which Dr. Miller-Idriss had mentioned earlier, and that is white supremacist and nationalist myth about immigrant populations arriving to Europe or North America and replacing whites. So it's worth noting that this Great Replacement myth has appeared in a lot of white supremacist terrorist manifestos. And unfortunately, as I previously mentioned, it has been gaining wider traction, especially because some more mainstream media pundits have actually used the same rhetoric, and it is spreading beyond the realm of the more niche white supremacist spaces that you might have associated that with perhaps years earlier. So I think perhaps some of the important takeaways when we see these conspiracies and other conspiracies that have not been mentioned, we should perhaps think and ask ourselves, what is the intertwining nature and convergence of narratives? And although I've listed these 3 separate conspiracies, quite often there is a lot of overlap where, of course, racism built into the COVID pandemic myth, and I mean the myth about COVID and where it originated, and then the existence of, this kind of like this Great Replacement type rhetoric, and then, anti-Semitism and wider, more white supremacist rhetoric being tied into QAnon conspiracy theories as well in certain communities. So it's important to ask, how are these narratives converging? Also, how does the decentralized nature of these communities allow for adaptation and flexibility of these narratives, as well as their ability to absorb other conspiracies around them? And then also, it's important to note where are they branching off into new platforms and social media apps, especially as there are efforts to stem this type of rhetoric on other platforms, because always you will find these individuals going onto encrypted platforms, for example, and trying to find a new home where they can keep circulating their content. So it's important to keep an eye on where exactly are these communities involved in platform migration away from the more well-known social media apps. And then also, it might be helpful to see how do significant news events impact the trajectories of these conspiracy theories, and which type of reactions do they elicit from adherents? And it can be varied, right? Just because someone is like a QAnon supporter, it is actually quite diverse within these communities themselves. So it's interesting to see subsets of these conspiracy theorist adherents and notice how does one group react one way or the other group react the other way. And that might be important to note as well. And then finally, what are the connections between communities across international borders, and how do these narratives travel from one country to the next? Or, for example, like there being a strong link between Quebec and France in terms of a lot of these COVID conspiracies. So I just wanted to keep my comments short, but thank you again, everyone.
Thank you all. And now, Constanze, if you could give us your perspective from Germany.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank AICGS for the invitation to this event, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. And in my short presentation, I will briefly add on to what my co-panelists already said by providing additional insights from Germany. So I will characterize, so to say, the average Querdenker, that is lateral thinkers in English. Those are the proponents of the protest movement against pandemic policies in Germany and the German-speaking world. And this movement has rallied protesters to the street since the spring and summer of 2020. I will briefly discuss the challenges this movement poses, as parts of it seem to radicalize and turn to more extremist practices the longer the pandemic drags on and the longer this already mentioned uncertainty persists. And I will briefly touch upon what needs to be done or what should be done, even though my co-panelists have already briefly touched upon this, and I'm sure we will discuss after my presentation. So the starting point for my thinking about this and for my article on the webpage were my observations at the Querdenker protests in Germany and Austria in the summer and fall of 2020. And the first thing that really struck me was that this is not a sort of young movement similar to Fridays for Future, but that the protesters were rather older. So most of them seem to be over the age of 40. They seem to belong to a rather well-off middle class, come from financially stable backgrounds. And the second observation was that the motivations and causes to join these protests seem to be rather diverse. So we had individuals who were small business owners, and they were just simply against lockdown restrictions and hygiene rules. But there were also like fervent anti-vaxxers, proponents of homeopathy and esotericism, Christian fundamentalists, and even monarchists. And this gathering of these various groups happened in a rather casual and peaceful atmosphere at these first protests. However, when looking closer at their signs, and you could already see that they exhibited conspiracy theories. So they attacked the media, they relativized the Holocaust, so they likened Nazi atrocities to mask mandates, or they held posters and banners against alleged population-wide experiments with testing and vaccines, or accused the media of being accomplices in a new Holocaust. Other signs that were visible referred, of course, to the Great Replacement. Some were wearing QAnon shirts. So a very colorful gaggle of people. And these observations, so my observations from the summer and fall, have now been confirmed by one of the first studies that have been conducted in this milieu. And namely, the researchers found that the political attitudes and motivations for joining the protests are quite diverse, but the protesters are, what really unites them is their distrust in the government and the mainstream media. And what we also know is the decreased trust in democracy and institutions has been linked to belief in conspiracy theories in the past. And therefore it is very unsurprising that conspiracy theories are more widespread among the Querdenker than among the general population. So for instance, more than 50% of the Querdenker believe that, quote unquote, secret organizations have influence on political decision-making, or that political leaders are just the puppets of secretive powers. So this is more than 50% among the Querdenker. Among the general German population, this is only believed by around 20%. And this has been stable during the pandemic. So even though we talk more about conspiracy theories, it doesn't seem that more people start believing in them in Germany. But that's not like good news only. So, and the most interesting point the study found is, because it also indicates where this movement is going as it progresses, is about the self-understanding of these protesters as rational critics of a so-called corona dictatorship, or they even see themselves as heroic resistance fighters and self-sacrificing martyrs. And in their conspiracist worldview, democracy, rule of law, and freedom of speech are in decline or even under attack. And this is also where I believe the danger lies, because this resistance image also unites otherwise very diverse groups. I mentioned anti-vaxxers, proponents of alternative medicine, and as the pandemic drags on and the crisis persists, their conspiracist worldview is also what where they find common ground with more extremist groups that are already well established and notorious in the German-speaking world. That doesn't mean that all of these protesters on the streets in Berlin and Stuttgart and Munich are right-wing extremists, because in general, what we also know is that the movement lacks clear authoritarian tendencies. However, the presence and support of extremist actors on the streets and within the movement has been met with indifference during protests, or has even been welcomed by organizers. So in conclusion, I will soon finish, is that the longer this pandemic drags on and the more these Querdenker feel backed into a corner or stigmatized, the more they seem to be ready to engage in acts of violence and sabotage. So And we already know from previous studies that belief in conspiracy theories may lead to engagement in non-normative political behavior or criminal activities. And what is very concerning is that these attacks and acts of sabotage are no longer the sort of specialty of authorities or of extremists known to the authorities, but what we see here is a rather quick and sudden radicalization of individuals from the so-called center of society, so from the Mitte, who now seem to be ready to engage in violence. And in the article I wrote, I mentioned the attack in Ida Oberstein, which happened in September of this year, where the perpetrator was a 49-year-old web developer from a very stable background, and he walked into a gas station and murdered the cashier because he was frustrated with pandemic rules and couldn't reach Angela Merkel and the government. So he took it out on his victim, and his social media activity clearly showed that he was a supporter of Querdenken and Donald Trump and QAnon for that matter, but he wasn't known in any way to the authorities to hold extremist views. So we can see that certain parts of this very diverse movement seems to be ready to take action, fueled by their conspiracist worldview. And this is happening unbeknownst to the authorities. So in conclusion, I agree with my co-panelists that the best strategy to counter these developments is to reach people before they have contact with conspiracy theories and extremist worldviews or misinformation. And we certainly need more education and media and social literacy, as well as other preventive work. And while the Querdenken movement and similar movements in other places seem to be gearing towards violence, what gives me hope is that at least in the German-speaking world, this movement does not have many young proponents. So only 10% of these Querdenker are under the age of 30. And we also know that conspiracist worldviews are forming during adolescence. So I would like to close by underlining the already proposed inoculation strategy, because we as a society, as educators, as policymakers, and as family members and friends, so we need to reach people before conspiracy theorists do, because what we also see from conspiracy theorists is that they are always on a mission to recruit for their cause. I'm in contact with some conspiracy theorists from the German-speaking world, and they are always trying to recruit me. And what Meili mentioned is because conspiracy theories are so decentralized and they encourage people to do research on their own, they also give them agency in times of crisis when they feel powerless. And this is where the great danger lies. And now I'll stop, and thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you all. This has already been a very, very fascinating discussion, and the questions have already been coming in. So I will go ahead and kick things off. Back to Constanze in Germany. Can you speak to what connections, if any, you have seen between the Querdenken, the AfD, and the Flügel, which is the extreme far-right wing of the Alternative for Germany?
Yes, so the alternative, sorry, now the question is, it's in the answer tab, sorry. The Alternative for Germany is the populist radical right party in Germany, and der Flügel is their even more radical wing. So what we see is that the AfD cannot really capitalize on these voters because the Querdenker, they are completely separated from the political mainstream, and many of them, so it is true, many of them voted for the AfD in the previous election. Many of them did also vote for the Green Party or the Linke in the previous election, but by now it seems that most of the Querdenker, they would not vote for, or they did not have the intent to vote for the AfD in the Bundestagswahl, but many of them voted for the Basis, which is a new party, which was actually, it's also referred to the Querdenker party in Germany, that really just embodies all of these diverse views under a conspiracist umbrella.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question about, to bring more transatlantic aspect into it, what are the main differences and similarities you've seen between the US and German conspiracist movements? And I mean, do you see them feeding off of each other? Is there some sort of, transnational communication between German and American conspiracy theorists? Maybe one of our American contributors can kick us.
Well, I could take a brief stab. One, I would say that QAnon has surprised us all a little bit, I think, in terms of how quickly and how deeply it took root in Germany, but it's in dozens and dozens of countries, right? So it's not just Germany where you're seeing it, but there is a particular history of conspiracy theories in the US. So the US has this rootedness, from the very beginning of its origins as a republic. It's been a place where there have been deep conspiracy theories and skepticism of the government and of organized anything really, of organized anything that might infringe on individual freedom or speak to a powerful group of elites trying to manipulate or orchestrate something. And so it's shown up, perpetually. So I think the US has a very long history of it. I think we lack very good political education in general, certainly not any kind of centralized political education as you have in Germany. And then, as in any form of extremism at all, the major difference, of course, is that as a nation, we are incredibly heavily armed with ridiculous amounts of weapons circulating and ammunition shortages. So anytime you have a fringe situation, it lends itself, although there have been violent episodes in Germany, as we just heard from Constanze as well, the potential for violence that comes out of the conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement, or even from QAnon, of people who believe they're being heroic and then taking action, but have the means to take really violent and deadly and lethal action. I think it lends a sense of urgency to it here that I think is hard to understand without bringing that issue into the discussion.
Anyone else have anything to add? Brian?
I think there's an interesting point to be made about digital communication technology. We've done work on COVID conspiracies in the French-speaking world at Peril. And one of our key findings was that these messages, they disseminate throughout a language group, but they're received differently depending on the culture and region. But the really key takeaway for our discussion here is that they disseminate throughout a language group. The language group is really the important defining feature rather than national borders. So when it comes to the way that Germany and the United States might be cross-pollinating when it comes to these conspiracy theories, it's worth, I think, taking into consideration the fact that it's more common for Germans to speak English than for Americans to speak German. So that affects the flow of these conspiracy theories. That makes it more likely that conspiracy theories are going to originate in the United States and migrate to Germany rather than in the other direction.
Thanks. And we kind of have a follow-up question on that, maybe for Constanze. So did the Querdenker model themselves after QAnon? In terms of the name, like there seems to be a lot of QAnon adherents within the Querdenker movement. So do you think that is the case?
Short answer is no. Long answer is that So this Querdenken, this lateral thinking is like, I mean, it has a Wikipedia article you can read on it. So it's a word that has been around the German-speaking world for quite a while. So I'm doing research on Austria in the 1990s, and there are all of these right-wing extremists who call themselves Querdenker in 1998. So it's a term that has been around the German-speaking world and a certain scene in Germany that goes against the mainstream. So it's all about going against the mainstream. So I don't think they modeled themselves after QAnon. I haven't found out yet how the Querdenken movement of 2020 got their name, but I'll keep you posted on that.
Thanks. So we have another question again about Germany. So how much of an influence does Germany's past, so specifically the Stasi and informants in East Germany, have on the Querdenkers' distrust of government?
Certainly there is an influence, because we know that the Querdenken movement and other sort of resistance movements against the government in Germany are very strong, for instance, in Saxony, in East Germany, which is also a part of Germany where during the, how do you call it in English? During socialism, sorry, I had to find the right word. So during socialism and during the GDR times in Saxony, there was still a strong community of churches that were kind of still tolerated by the regime. But on the other hand, the Querdenken movement is also very strong in Southwest Germany. So I'm in Baden-Württemberg, and actually Stuttgart is, so to say, the cradle of the Querdenker movement. And this is because this part of Germany has also a very strong tradition of resistance against the government and resistance against elites, so to say. Also, esotericism is very strong in Baden-Württemberg, so that also pays into this. So the two centers of Querdenken in Germany are Baden-Württemberg and Saxony.
Okay, thanks. And I had a question about, prevention and inoculation, as you guys have termed it. And I was wondering, who are the best actors in terms of getting out education? Is it, people in institutions, maybe like, government people, conspiracy theorists might already be skeptical of them. Educators, people might also be skeptical of, should it be a civil society movement? Should I, be on Facebook sharing these tips with my friends? I was just wondering, who should be the actors in this inoculation?
One of the unfortunate facts about inoculation is that it is extremely effective with people who have not yet made up their minds, people who are agnostic or who just haven't considered an issue. When it comes to people who are committed to the undesirable way of thinking, take the COVID-19 case. It's someone who's very much against public health measures or thinks it's a conspiracy or who denies that it exists or is important. Those people are relatively hard to reach with inoculation. Inoculation doesn't really work with the same effectiveness on those people. And in our work in the United States, what we found is that when we're inoculating those agnostic or yet to consider populations, someone who looks like their general practitioner, their family doctor, in other words, is a very effective communicator. People express a great deal of trust in their family doctor, despite despite all the mistrust of the medical establishment and the pharmaceutical industry in the United States. People still really like the person who gives them their annual physical and who takes care of their children when they're sick.
Yeah, I'll just add that we've been testing videos. And so what Brian is referring to is the who's the actor in the video. So who's the actual messenger who delivers the message. I think, and we've been experimenting with different lengths of videos. So the videos that we just did on anti-vax propaganda we used real doctors were the messengers, and the length of the video were 30 seconds so that they can eventually be distributed as advertisements on social media. So that's the channel. And I think, your question, Liz, sort of has two different things. Who's the right deliverer of the message? And also what's the right way to communicate the message? And I think we're looking for ways to get at scale distribution of messages, inoculation kinds of messages in online contexts where it's not even through a formal structure necessarily, but just shows up the way that people encounter disinformation, the way that they would encounter an inoculation message in their everyday lives as they explore spaces online. But I think it can be done in formal education and formal curriculum as a preventative measure as well. I mean, we've certainly seen that and been talking about doing that with Holocaust denial work and with conspiracies, in partnership with museums, in partnership with schools and educational curricula. I think there are lots of different places where it could take place and be effective.
All right, thank you. And on the other side of that, one of our attendees wants to know, who are the bad actors spreading disinformation, and maybe what is their motivation behind spreading this disinformation?
So this is a great question for Meili, because you spend so much time for us in the dark spaces with the bad actors. Can you talk a little bit about how do you find them, the sources and the channels of that information?
Sure. Thanks, Cynthia. And thanks for the question, Jennifer. So yeah, I spend a lot of time specifically on Telegram. So that experience might shape my response based off of the subjective area where I like to kind of dig into the various communities there. But I do think maybe it's a non-answer, but I think it can be actually so diverse that you can't really pinpoint it. Oh, sorry, siren, y'all. Hope it's not too loud. But that you can't really pinpoint it towards one motivation or one type of strategy. It's actually quite a diverse array, just as diverse as the individuals that you will find in these communities. So for white supremacist, great replacement type people, they want a huge goal that I've noticed, especially in the manifestos, but as well as the chatter online, and then again the repeating of these narratives on platforms like Fox News, is the mainstreaming of these narratives into the wider public and shifting that relative Overton window, so it becomes part of the norm, right? So you're shifting more towards extremist rhetoric, which will now be seen as something that's not as shocking as it might have been 5 years ago, let's say. And then also, I think regardless of conspiracy or whether it's white supremacists, I think there's also the draw of trying to broaden the recruitment pool. They want more people to be involved in these things and to latch on to these conspiracies, or to become involved in white supremacist groups, whether it's even just like in a more online decentralized format. And I think the online aspect really changes the dynamics of what is going on and what the goals are, because sometimes honestly it really is just it's not to minimize it, but it is also just the maybe sense of empowerment or trolling of shit posting. There also is that as well. So, and there of course are so many other motivations out there and goals, but these are just some of the main ones that come to mind for me when thinking about these questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Meili. And Constanze, we're talking in the US, like we have Germany, of course, has like these social media channels, but they don't have a version of our Fox News. So is there another way that these conspiracy theories are getting mainstreamed? Is there another media outlet, or is it mostly through these online decentralized channels?
I mean, yes, gladly, Germany does not have a Fox News, but there are, of course, there are certain very right-wing extremist outlets in the German-speaking world, because they are never only just catering to Germany, they are always catering to Austria and Switzerland as well. In many cases, they are run by Swiss nationals or Austrian nationals who are not even sitting in their home country, but they are sitting in the Philippines, so you can not really catch them. So yeah, there are these news portals that cater to this audience, because what I'm also in many Telegram groups, and what you can see there is they never share German speaking mainstream media. It's always these extremist outlets that, of course, I mean, you all know this from the US as well, that just appear to be, from their appearance as a website, they seem to be a very serious news platform. And what I would, as a historian, I would also like to point out that, I mean, all of these, or many of these news sites online, they are run by people who have been running fringe publications in German for decades or for years. So there has been a right-wing extremist media environment before the rise of the internet.
Thanks. And we are quickly coming to the close of our session, but I want to give a final question to kind of tie this to our transatlantic focus from the AICGS Director of Programs and Grants, Susanne Dieper. And she's asking, can Germany and the US address this danger in a joint effort? Is there a way is there already a way that people in the US and Germany are working together to counteract these dangerous conspiracy theories?
Yes, yes, and yes. I would just say, we are in peril. We have several collaborative projects with funders and with colleagues in Germany. Several of us will be spending our next summer in 2022 in Berlin, forging some of that work in greater depth with our partners overseas. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of interest, there's a lot more need. And I think it's one of those moments where I see a ton of lessons to be learned from the German experience, not just on conspiracy theories, but on interventions and prevention for the US, because there's been so much more investment. But I'm sure that it's a two-way street. I'm sure that there are things that are happening here that could be of mutual benefit. So I think there's a lot of room for further collaboration and discussion. And I see this as just scratching the surface.
Great. Constanze, any perspectives from your work?
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm not so much, I have to admit, I'm not familiar what's happening between Germany and the US, but I know that there is also much talk about on the level of the European Union, because I don't think that this is necessarily a problem that only affects Germany and the US, but that affects all of Europe. And as I think was also pointed out during our session, is that these are truly transnational narratives that travel across borders and across languages, because there is always somebody who can translate the crudest conspiracy theory into German or Hungarian or whatever.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for this really fascinating discussion. We really appreciate you taking part in this project. And for all of our audience members who want more, all of our panelists have written articles. They can be found on our website under the project page about the transatlantic coordination in times of global crises. If you enjoyed this, it's also Giving Tuesday. So I would encourage you, if you are considering end of year giving, to give to AICGS or your other favorite local nonprofit. And thank you all again for joining us and giving us these great questions.